I remember standing there blinking into the sunlight trying to understand where I was supposed to be afraid. Just moments earlier, at least it felt that way, I had been somewhere else entirely. North Africa. Sand in my mouth, diesel smoke, the sound of artillery rolling across the desert like distant thunder. We had surrendered after Rommel's army collapsed. By then, most of us were exhausted boys wearing men's uniforms. We were hungry, we were dehydrated, and we were terrified. Before we laid down our weapons, we were told exactly what would happen next. If you surrender to the Americans, they said you will be shot, not imprisoned, not questioned. Shot. So, when the firing stopped and none of us were dead, we assumed it was only a matter of time. They marched us away from the battlefield. They searched us. They counted us again and again. Then they put us on ships. I remember the smell of the ocean sharp unfamiliar, the way the deck rolled beneath my feet. Weeks passed, or days. I'm not sure anymore. Time loses its meaning when you believe you are being transported to your execution. We crossed an ocean, that much I knew. When we finally disembarked, we were no longer in Africa. We were no longer even near Europe. They loaded us onto trains that ran endlessly inland, through landscapes I had never seen in my life. Green fields, open skies, wide roads. "This is the farthest place from Germany," one of the guards said casually, as if discussing the weather. At some point, I stopped asking questions. Then, one morning in 1944, the train stopped. We were ordered out. The air felt different, lighter, warmer. They marched us down a dirt road. And then I saw them. Orange trees. At first I thought my mind had finally broken. The branches were heavy with fruit, bright, almost unreal in color. The smell was sweet, fresh. The sun rested on my back, not like the desert sun that burned and punished, but like something gentle, almost kind. This is wrong, I remember thinking. Prison camps were supposed to be gray. Cold, violent. This looked like something from a postcard. They handed us baskets. They showed us how to twist the fruit free without damaging the branch. No one shouted. No one raised a rifle. Across the dirt road, I noticed a farmhouse. White walls, a porch, laundry hanging in the sun. I kept waiting for the moment when the illusion would end. I worked with my head down, half expecting a blow. Every time a guard walked past, my muscles tightened. Nothing happened. The ground beneath my boots was dry and solid. The smell of citrus clung to my hands. A breeze moved through the leaves above us. I looked around at the other men, boys, really. Faces thin from rationing and months of retreat. Some of them were smiling. That frightened me more than anything else. We had been told what Americans were. Brutal, vengeful, unforgiving. Yet, here we were harvesting fruit under a clear sky. At one point, I glanced up and met the eyes of a woman standing near the farmhouse. She didn't look afraid of us. She didn't look angry. She just watched as if observing any other group of workers. I remember thinking, this cannot be real. In Africa, we had learned to measure time by explosions. Here, time passed with the slow movement of shadows across the field. At lunch, we were given food, real food, bread that was soft, water that tasted clean. I ate slowly, afraid it would be taken away. No one hurried us. By the end of the day, my arms were sore, my back ached. But I was asleep. At night, lying on a cot under a roof instead of open sky, I stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what had happened. Had we been spared by mistake? Was this kindness temporary? Or had everything we'd been taught about surrender been a lie? Somewhere in the darkness, someone whispered what all of us were thinking. Maybe we're already dead. Because this warmth, this quiet, this ordinary life, this was not what hell was wrong to look like. That first night, none of us slept. Not because anything happened, but because nothing did. In Africa, silence usually meant something was coming. A raid, an ambush, an order shouted into the dark. Here, the night was quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. I lay on my cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing. Around me, other men shifted, coughed, softly turned their heads. No one spoke above a whisper. We were waiting. We had been trained to wait for pain. Most of us were young, 17, 18, 19, old enough to carry rifles, but not old enough to unlearn what we had been told since boyhood. We had grown up on stories not of mercy, but of enemies. America, we were taught, was rich and cruel. They would starve us slowly. They would beat us for sport. They would punish surrender as weakness. In Germany, by 1943, fear had already become ordinary. Bombs fell at night, sometimes during the day. Factories burned. Cities disappeared piece by piece. Food grew scarce. Soap became a luxury. Letters from home arrived thinner, shorter, more desperate. We had learned to expect loss. So when we were captured, we did not expect survival to feel gentle. The camp in California did make sense. There were no walls topped with wire, no dogs, no shouting. The dirt road that led past the orange groves had no gate. The nearby houses looked like any village I remembered from before the war. Windows open, curtains moving in the breeze. That frightened us. I kept waiting for someone to come and take my boots. In Africa, your boots were taken first, then your belt, then anything that reminded you that you had once been a person. Here, no one touched our belongings. They gave us blankets, real blankets. That night I folded mine carefully, expecting it to be taken away by morning. It wasn't. At dawn, an American guard walked through the barracks calling out names. Names, not numbers. He pronounced them badly, but he tried. When he reached me, he looked down at a clipboard and said my name slowly, as if it mattered that he got it right. I remember thinking, this must be a trick. In Germany, by that point in the war, names had already started to disappear. You became a number in a factory, a number in a ration line, a number in a report sent to Berlin. Here, someone was calling my name. We lined up, still waiting for punishment, still bracing for something. Nothing happened. They handed us tools and led us back to the groves. The sun was already warm. As we worked, my mind kept drifting back home to the ruins that my mother now lived among. To streets I knew were no longer streets at all. We had seen photographs before being deployed. Images of Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, whole neighborhoods flattened. And yet, here across the ocean, the Americans seemed untouched by that devastation. They had food to spare. Enough guards that they didn't need to shout. Enough confidence that they didn't need to threaten. That unsettled me more than cruelty would have. During a break, they handed us bars of soap. I turned mine over in my hands, suspicious. It smelled strange. Not like the harsh, lye-heavy soap we used at home when we had soap at all. This one had a clean, almost sweet scent. I remember thinking, why waste this on us? That night I washed my hands again and again, half expecting someone to stop me. No one did. Still, fear stayed with us. Not fear of what was happening, but fear of what memory told us must come next. We whispered to each other after lights out. They'll separate us. They'll take our letters. They'll come at night. Every story we shared ended the same way, with someone being dragged away in the dark. That was how fear worked back home. The knock at the door, the boots on the stairs, the sudden absence at the breakfast table. So, when footsteps echoed outside the barracks after midnight, my heart nearly stopped. I held my breath. The footsteps passed. Morning came. Still nothing. Days went by like this. Work, food, roll call, no beatings, no disappearances. Slowly, we began to realize something unsettling. The Americans were not watching us the way we expected. They didn't look at us with hatred. They didn't look at us with fear. Mostly they looked bored. Their rifles stayed slung over their shoulders. Their voices were casual. One of them even joked I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. In Germany, authority always announced itself loudly. Here, authority seemed unnecessary. That made us uneasy. At lunch one day, I sat under the shade of a tree holding my bread when I noticed the woman from the farmhouse again. She crossed the dirt road slowly, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. She spoke to one of the guards first, then she turned toward us, and she spoke German. Not perfect German, but familiar. The sound hit me harder than hunger ever had. For a moment, I felt exposed, as if the war had peeled something open inside me. She asked simple questions. Where we were from, how old we were. No accusations, no lectures. Just questions you ask people. That night fear finally shifted. It didn't disappear, but it changed shape. Instead of waiting for violence, we began to fear hope. Because hope, if it proved false, would hurt far more than any blow. In Germany, by 1944, hope was dangerous. You learned to suppress it. But here, in this place that felt too calm, too clean, too normal, hope kept creeping in anyway. and that terrified us. Because if this kindness was real, then everything we had been taught was wrong. And if everything we had been taught was wrong, we had no idea who we were anymore. I noticed the farm before I noticed the woman. It sat across the dirt road close enough that we could see the porch from where we worked. White walls, a low roof, windows open most days. Laundry moved slowly in the breeze. At first, it was just part of the landscape, another detail that made this place feel wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Prison camps were supposed to be isolated, removed, cut off from ordinary life. This one wasn't. People lived here. I saw her watching us one morning, not staring, not hiding, just standing near the edge of the property, hands resting loosely at her sides as if she were watching any group of workers in her field. I expected her to look afraid. She didn't. The first time she crossed the dirt road, we stiffened without thinking. Someone whispered, "Stay alert." We were used to civilians who looked at us with hatred or disgust, or who refused to look at us at all. She did neither. She walked slowly, deliberately, as if she did not want to startle anyone. When she spoke, I didn't understand at first why my chest tightened. Then I realized why. She was speaking German. Not perfect German. Not formal. The kind of German spoken at kitchen tables. She asked simple questions. Where we were from. How old we were. If we were managing the heat. No accusations, no political words. Just the kind of things adults ask young people who are working too hard in the sun. Later, I learned her story. She was a second-generation German-American. Her parents had come from Europe long before the war. German had been the language of her childhood. They had lived in Wisconsin once. During the Great Depression, when jobs vanished and farms failed, they moved west to California like so many others looking for a fresh start. She did not carry Germany in her loyalties. She carried it in her voice. That difference mattered. The first time she invited us to lunch, none of us knew how to respond. Prisoners were not invited anywhere. We looked to the guards. One of them shrugged, another nodded. So we followed her across the dirt road, walking carefully as if crossing an invisible line. The guard came with us. He sat at the table too, bored, quiet, his rifle leaning against the wall. No one spoke at first. The table was plain wood, scratched, worn smooth by years of use. There was bread, soup, fruit, nothing extravagant, but nothing withheld. I remember the sound of chairs being pulled out, the clink of spoons against bowls. Ordinary sounds. That was what undid me. In Germany by then, meals had become tense affairs. Eaten quickly, portions measured, conversations hushed. Here the food arrived and stayed. No one watched to see how fast we ate. No one counted bites. She asked us to pass the bread. I froze for a moment before realizing she was speaking to me. I passed it. She smiled. It was not a smile meant to reassure. It was not a smile meant to instruct. It was the smile people give when they expect nothing in return. We did not talk about the war. No one mentioned uniforms or flags. She asked about families, about towns we had grown up in, about whether California felt strange to us. It did. It felt like a place that existed outside of time. After lunch, we stood awkwardly, unsure what came next. She thanked us for helping on the farm. Thanked us. The guard stood up and said it was time to go. As we crossed back over the dirt road, no one spoke. That night, something changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but a weight shifted inside me. Until then, kindness had felt like a performance, something that might end the moment we stopped behaving. This felt different. It was not offered to prove anything. It was offered because it was there. Over the weeks that followed, it happened again. Sometimes lunch. Sometimes just conversation. Always with the guard present. Always without ceremony. She never asked us to be grateful. Never reminded us that we were prisoners. She spoke to us like young men whose lives had taken a wrong turn. I began to realize that her kindness was not exceptional. It was consistent. That was more unsettling than cruelty would have been. Cruelty, I understood. It fit the world as I had been taught to see it. This did not. I watched how she treated the guard, no differently than she treated us. I watched how the guard treated us at her table, relaxed, human. It occurred to me then that this was not just about her. This was about the space she lived in. America, I was beginning to understand, was not a place where kindness had to be announced. It could exist quietly, without banners or speeches. Back in the camp, we talked about her in whispers. Not because we were afraid, but because we did not want to disturb something fragile. One of the younger men said, "If this is real, I don't know what to do with it." None of us did. The war continued elsewhere. People were dying in numbers we could not comprehend. And yet, here in this small corner of California, a woman crossed a dirt road and shared a meal with men she had been told were the enemy. She did not do this to change history. She did not know that anyone would remember. She did it because it felt natural to her. That was what stayed with me. Years later, when people asked what America was like, I did not talk first about policies or laws. I talked about a table, about a woman who spoke my language without suspicion, about the sound of spoons on bowls while the war burned an ocean away. There were no speeches, no gestures meant for history, only food, only a table, only people, and somehow that was enough to change everything. There was a moment when I realized my fear had changed. It didn't come suddenly. There was no single day when everything felt different. It crept in quietly between breakfasts, between shifts in the fields, between evenings that ended without explosions. At first, I was afraid of being hurt. Then I was afraid of being deceived. And finally, I was afraid of something else entirely. I was afraid of going home. The war in Europe did not pause for us. We heard about it in fragments through newspapers we barely understood, through guards' conversations, through letters that arrived weeks late and heavily censored. Cities were being erased. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin. Names that once meant streets and houses now meant smoke and rubble. Back home, my mother learned to sleep in cellars. My younger cousins learned to recognize the sound of different aircraft. Food became smaller, thinner, less frequent. Here in California, the days unfolded with almost unbearable regularity. Breakfast came every morning at the same hour. Eggs, bread, coffee, not always plentiful, but consistent. I later learned the numbers 3,000, sometimes 3,200 calories a day. Enough to work. Enough to recover weight we had lost long before capture. No one announced this as generosity. No one explained it. The food simply arrived. After breakfast, we were assigned work, not punishment. Work. We labored on farms and warehouses along rail lines. We sorted fruit, loaded crates, repaired fences. They gave us gloves, thick ones meant to protect hands, not break them. They showed us how to lift properly so we wouldn't injure our backs. I remember thinking, why do they care if I get hurt? At the end of the day, they paid us, not in cash, but in camp script. Little slips of paper we could use at the canteen, for toothpaste, for writing paper, for extra soap. I stared at those pieces of paper the first time they were handed to me. Pay, for a prisoner. Back in Germany by 1944, labor meant something else entirely. It meant coercion. It meant exhaustion. It meant disappearing into factories where no one asked if you were tired. Here, the guards reminded us to drink water. They rotated us out of the sun. And when someone collapsed from heat, they called a medic, not a punishment detail. Slowly, the framework I had carried since childhood began to crack. I had been raised on certainty. Certainty about enemies. Certainty about strength. Certainty about how the world worked. That certainty could survive violence. It could not survive routine kindness. No one lectured us about democracy. No one told us we were being re-educated. No slogans hung on the walls. No speeches were delivered. They simply handed me work gloves and trusted that I would do the job. That trust was unbearable. In America, I began to understand war looked different. Men were overseas fighting. Women filled the factories. We heard the phrase, often the arsenal of democracy. Trains moved constantly. Warehouses stayed busy. Everything seemed oriented toward production, not destruction. German prisoners became part of that system not as slaves, but as laborers regulated by law. We were told this was allowed, that international agreements required it. The Geneva Convention. I had never heard of it before. At night, lying on my cot, I tried to reconcile this with what I knew of home. In Germany, ideology came first, people second. Here, procedure came first, and somehow that left room for humanity. As months passed, we learned English not in classrooms but through repetition. Commands, jokes, snatches of conversation overheard while loading crates. Language did something strange to us. It made the guards less abstract, less monstrous. It made us less anonymous. One guard asked me once where I was from. I told him the name of my town. He nodded as if it mattered. That night, I realized something terrifying. I was becoming comfortable. Not safe, but human again. When news came that the war was nearing its end, it did not bring relief, it brought dread. What would we return to homes without roofs? Factories reduced to skeletons. Families who had learned to survive without us. Some of the younger men spoke openly about staying, not defecting, not escaping, just not returning. In the chaos after the surrender, records vanished. Borders blurred. Opportunities appeared in the cracks left by destruction. Some men disappeared quietly into civilian life. Not because America had tempted them, but because Germany had nothing left to offer them but ruins. The realization hit me one evening as I stood near the edge of the camp watching the sun lower over the fields. I was not afraid of punishment anymore. I was afraid of losing this version of myself, the one who had learned how to work without hatred, how to eat without fear, how to sleep without expecting boots on the stairs. The breakdown was not loud. It didn't look like tears or rage. It looked like silence. Like standing still and realizing that the world I had been promised could not survive contact with the world I was living in. America had not convinced me with words. It had undone me with normalcy. And I understood then this was not mercy as weakness. This was strength so secure it did not need to prove itself through cruelty. This, I realized, was how America won. The realization did not come all at once. It arrived quietly in the space between things that never happened. No beatings, no starvation, no midnight removals. At some point, I understood something that unsettled me more than fear ever had. What we were experiencing was not improvisation. It was intention. I had spent months waiting for the kindness to end, for the masks to drop, for the war to reveal its true face. But the days continued in the same steady rhythm. Food, work, sleep. And the longer this rhythm held, the harder it became to believe it was accidental. Back home, systems existed to extract obedience. They relied on fear, on spectacle, on punishment made visible. Here, control looked different. The Americans did not seem worried about us. They did not feel the need to remind us constantly of our captivity. There were enough guards, enough food, enough structure. They did not need cruelty to maintain order. That was the moment my old beliefs began to collapse. In Germany, we were taught that mercy was weakness, that only force could secure loyalty, that fear was the natural language of power. But what I saw in California contradicted that at every level. We were fed not generously, but sufficiently. We were paid not to reward us, but to acknowledge our labor. We were protected by rules not because we deserved them, but because the system required it, even when no one was watching. That detail mattered more than anything else. Kindness performed for an audience is easy to dismiss. Kindness repeated in private becomes something else entirely. One afternoon I asked a guard why we were treated this way. He looked at me confused by the question. "Those are the rules," he said. That was all. No sermon, no moral lecture, no attempt to convert me, just rules. Later I learned where those rules came from. International agreements, military manuals, procedures written far from the orange groves where we worked, the Geneva Convention. I had never heard the term before my capture. It had not been part of our education, but here, it governed everything: how much we ate, how long we worked, how we were housed, how we were paid. This was not softness, it was discipline. America, I began to understand, was not being kind because it felt sorry for us. It was being consistent because it believed in its own order. That belief ran deep. Men were overseas fighting. Women filled factories at home. Trains moved day and night. Everything I saw pointed toward one thing. This was a nation organized around production, not revenge. The Americans did not win by humiliating their enemies. They won by outworking them. Even we prisoners were part of that effort, not as tools to be broken, but as hands to be used responsibly. No one explained democracy to me. No one told me what I should think. They simply trusted me with work and expected me to do it properly. That trust cut deeper than any propaganda ever had. In Germany, trust was conditional. Here it was procedural. You followed the rules. So did they. And the rules applied even when it would have been easy to ignore them. That was the awakening. Not an emotional conversion, not a sudden admiration. A recognition. America had decided long before I arrived that it would not become what it was fighting. That decision was made in offices written into manuals and carried out by ordinary soldiers who never questioned it. The guard who called my name each morning was not making a moral statement. He was doing his job, and somehow that made it stronger, because values that survive bureaucracy are values that last. I began to see the war differently after that. Victory was not just measured in territory or surrender documents, it was measured in restraint, in the ability to hold power without abusing it. That restraint required confidence. Only a nation certain of its strength could afford to treat enemies as human beings, and only a generation raised to believe in law over impulse could carry that certainty through a global war. Years later, people would argue about America's choices, about its mistakes, about its contradictions. But standing there in 1944 wearing work gloves instead of shackles, being paid for my labor instead of punished for my existence, I understood something undeniable. This was not mercy by chance. This was America choosing who it would be even when it would have been easier to choose otherwise. And that choice, repeated thousands of times by ordinary people, was how the war was truly won. Here was something I did not understand at first. It took years, not days, for the question to fully form. While I was learning English in California, while I was being paid for my labor, while I was being protected by rules that applied even when no one was watching, something else was happening nearby. I did not see it from inside the camp. I heard about it later from conversations, from stories passed quietly from people who remembered what not to accuse, not to absolve, but to understand. When I think back to California, to the orange groves, to the dirt road, to the woman who spoke my language without suspicion, I do not feel anger. I feel a complicated gratitude. Gratitude for the humanity I was shown, and a quiet sorrow for those who were denied it. That complexity is not weakness. It is honesty. And perhaps that, too, is part of what America was and still is trying to become. There is a moment that does not belong to the war. It happened years later, long after uniforms were folded away, long after camps were dismantled, long after the words enemy and ally had lost their sharpness. It happened on an ordinary street. The woman saw him first. He was older then. So was she. Time had softened the lines of his face. The posture was different. The fear was gone. But the recognition was immediate. He had become an American citizen. He spoke English without effort. What remained of his German accent was faint, a shadow more than a sound. They did not stare. They did not hesitate. They simply knew. There were no apologies. None were asked for. None were offered. Because apologies belong to guilt. And this meeting belonged to memory. What passed between them was gratitude. Quiet. Unspoken. Complete. Years earlier, she had crossed a dirt road. She had spoken to young men working under the sun. She had offered food conversation a place at a table. She had not done this to make a statement. She had not done it to correct history. She had done it because it felt ordinary to her. That is what stayed with me. History often teaches us to look for grand gestures for speeches, declarations, turning points. But the things that last are smaller. A name spoken instead of a number. A pair of work gloves handed over without comment. A paycheck that said, your labor matters. A meal eaten without fear. When I think about what followed the war, I do not think first of borders redrawn or treaties signed. I think of lives quietly rebuilt. Some of us returned to Germany. Some of us did not. Some carried America with them in language learned late and habits formed under strange skies in the memory of being treated as human when we expected to be broken. For the families who welcomed us, for the children who later heard these stories, the legacy did not live in medals or headlines. It lived in recognition, in the understanding that choices made under pressure reveal who a nation believes itself to be. I have been asked over the years what changed me. I could talk about laws, about policies, about international agreements, but those are explanations. What changed me was simpler. No one tried to convince me of anything. They did not lecture me about democracy. They did not demand gratitude. They did not ask. I could not. The family across the dirt road, the farmers whose land bordered our work site, they were German Americans. Second generation. They spoke German at home. It was the language they had grown up with, the language their parents had carried across the ocean. They talked to us openly. They invited us to lunch. They did not hide their interactions, and nothing happened to them. No arrests, no interrogations, no camps. They went on living their lives as Americans, working, farming, raising families while the war raged across the world. At the same time, other families disappeared. Not enemies, not prisoners, Americans. The Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans born in this country, raised here, many of them never having set foot in Japan. They had no contact with prisoners, no connection to enemy soldiers. And yet, they were taken. Families uprooted, businesses abandoned, homes left behind. They were sent to camps. When I first learned this, it unsettled me deeply, because it did not fit the picture I had been building in my mind. I wanted history to be clean. I wanted morality to be consistent, but it wasn't. The difference was not loyalty. It was not behavior. It was not action. It was race. That realization forced me to look back at my own experience with different eyes. America had treated me with restraint, with legality, with a sense of order that never needed to announce itself. And yet, at the same moment, it failed others who belonged to it. These two truths existed side by side. I struggled with that. For a long time, I tried to reconcile them, to explain one away in order to preserve the other. But history does not work that way. What I came to understand is this. The humanity I experienced was real. So was the injustice. They were not contradictions in memory. They were contradictions in reality. America, like every nation at war, acted from fear as well as principle. In my case, principle held. In others, fear won. That does not erase what I was given, but it complicates what it meant. Years later, when people spoke about the war as a story of clear heroes and villains, I found myself uncomfortable, because I had lived inside the gray. I had been an enemy treated with dignity while citizens were denied the same. That knowledge stayed with me. It taught me something important, not about nations, but about responsibility. The restraint shown to me did not happen automatically. It happened because individuals followed rules even when fear could have justified breaking them. The failure toward Japanese Americans happened when fear overwhelmed those same systems. Both outcomes were possible. Both happened. And that is what history demands we remember. Ask me to forget where I came from. They trusted me with work. They trusted me with routine. They trusted me with dignity. And they did so not once, but every day, even when it would have been easier not to. That trust reached further than the war ever did. It crossed generations. The children of those farmers grew up hearing fragments of these stories. The children of former prisoners carried different fragments, memories of hunger, interrupted by kindness, of fear, replaced by structure. Decades later, those fragments found each other again in conversations and letters and photographs taken without intention. That is how legacy works. Not as a monument, but as a thread. And it does not ask us to believe that the past was perfect. Only that at certain moments people chose restraint over rage law, over impulse humanity, over humiliation. Those moments matter. They matter to families. They matter to nations. They matter long after the uniforms are gone, and this photograph remains. Not to celebrate victory, but to record who America chose to be.